Tēnā koutou katoa, Ran Aho, and I'm delighted on behalf of Infrastructure New Zealand to facilitate this session. If you recall back a couple of days ago, we very much started a conversation at a macro level, really thinking about global issues and how they are playing out around the world. And then we brought it down to a New Zealand level, and really digesting that and really thinking around, well, what's the contextual and what is happening for us here in New Zealand. But yesterday we heard a lot, and actually have over the last couple of days, around creating resilient cities and the role that we all have to play in doing that, and particularly the role that infrastructure and transport plays around that. And now we're going to hear Auckland's story. So I'm delighted to introduce our guest speaker today, Shane Ellison, the Chief Executive of Auckland Transport. In his 4 years as Chief Exec, Shane has transformed the organization, developing and executing core business strategies to increase safety for road users and quality of service for customers, while considering the social, economic, environmental, and cultural expectations of Aucklanders. And we've heard a lot about that over the last couple of days. Utilizing his authentic style of leadership, he has led the uplift in both financial capability and the commercial culture of Auckland Transport, while increasing reputation and employee engagement and reducing death and serious injuries on our transport systems. His focus going forward is to expand on the reduced carbon emissions from Auckland Transport operations and supporting Aucklanders reduce our carbon emissions by changing the way we travel, while continuing to influence a reduction in serious injuries and further improve the experience for Aucklanders as a customer of Auckland Transport. In addition to his responsibilities at Auckland Transport, Shane holds governance positions on the Auckland Light Rail Establishment Unit, which we heard a lot yesterday about, and ATAP. And more recently, he's been appointed as the Director of Dunedin International Airport. So I give great pleasure for Shane to now join the virtual platform.
E nā iwi whānui ki ngā topito o te motu. He mihi manaho ki a koutou katoa. Te puni ki te raki, rakatu ki te rāwhiti, pukatutu ki te tonga. Waia ki te uru. Tāmaki hiri hiri o ngā waka e. Tihei Māori ora ki te whae ao ki te ao marama. Tēnā koe Tracy, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Morena everyone, pleasure to be with you here this morning at this Infrastructure New Zealand Building Nations Conference. You'll see some slides in front of you, and I want to start this morning with a whakatauki. And it goes something like this. Mo tātou aha, mo ka uri a muri aki nei. Some of you may recognise this whakatauki and know that it is held dear by my iwi kaitahu. But for those of you who are not familiar with it, it can be liberally translated as for us and our children after us. I particularly like this whakatauki because it speaks not only of us thinking for the future and our tamariki and mokopuna, but also for us ourselves today. And from my perspective, the bite is in the view that we can no longer think about the long-term actions to be taken by our children and grandchildren. We have to start doing things now for ourselves, because Aotearoa New Zealand, and indeed the world, has a number of crises on its hands. Or to steal a theme from this conference, we are at a fork in the road. In my mind, that fork in the road demands something different than just more of the same. Today, I'm going to offer you some reflections and provocations for that. I'll start with some context about recent transport infrastructure activity in Auckland, where I'll use a few visual aids before moving to my key message. So let's get started. My one and only other time speaking at an Infrastructure New Zealand conference was 2018, less than a year after I was appointed Chief Executive of Auckland Transport. The first 9 months were something of a baptism of fire. While I'm a proud mainlander, it had been 14 years between spells living in New Zealand, and the Auckland that I returned to was almost unrecognisable from the one I had left. Unrecognisable in terms of culture, in terms of size and scale, and in terms of built form. Human nature being what it is, we tend to focus on the negative. The city of cones, congestion and disruption. But in fact, the pace of change in Auckland has been quite extraordinary. Just a few weeks ago, during lockdown, quantity surveying firm Ryder Levitt Bucknell's half-yearly crane index shows there are 144 long-term cranes on skylines around Aotearoa. That is up from 136 in the previous 6 months. And as we all know, cranes on the skyline are a healthy indicator of the state of the economy and infrastructure activity. Auckland has the bulk of those cranes with 96, which is a significant net increase of 18 cranes from the 6 months previous. Well, Wellington has the second highest number of cranes with 16, followed by Christchurch on 14. So excuse the pun, but it is not just the public sector doing the heavy lifting. Over 50% of the temporary traffic management, or as I more fondly refer to them, the orange cones, in the Auckland city centre are actually the result of private development, catalysed in many cases by private sector investment. In the transport sector, we've been busy. The collage of photos in these next slides will showcase just how much has been commissioned in the last 3 years by many of you and the companies you work for contracting to AT, Waka Kotahi, Eki Panuku or KiwiRail. Just a selection of the infrastructure that's been built includes Manukau Bus Station, Pukekohe Rail and Bus Interchange, Murphy's Road, Redoubt Road Dynamic Half Moon Bay Bus and Ferry Interchange, Karangahape Road Streetscapes Upgrade, the downtown program including Te Wānanga, Quay Street, Galway Street, the Lower Albert Street Bus Interchange, Tikamititanga, and the new Ferry Basin. Puhinui Interchange, new electric trains, a hydrogen bus, electric buses, and electric AT local vehicles. Whangaparoa Dynamic Laning, Victoria Street Cycleway, over 30 high-risk intersection upgrades and hundreds of kilometres of rural road delineation. Northcote Point Ferry Wharf, Northcote Safe Route Cycleway, Hibiscus Coast Interchange, Takapuia Parking Building in Takapuna, new and improved park and ride facilities at locations such as Albany and Takanini, State Highway 1 improvements, State Highway 16 improvements, and State Highway 20B improvements. Whew, I'm tired. With that list alone, it's quite staggering what's been going on just in the transport sector. The performance across the sector over the last few years has been quite incredible. Auckland Transport alone, with the support of its supply chain partners, has delivered circa 94% on average of its budgeted capital program over the last 3 years. And all of that while dealing with COVID-19 disruptions. Thank you to all of us, all of those that are supporting us with this delivery. But this only scratches the surface, with many other projects in detailed design or construction right now. Here's just a few. Matakana Link Road, Aratuhono, Puhoida Warkworth, Eastern Busway Stage 1, which is just about complete, and stages 2 to 4. Glenninus to Tamaki Shared Path Stage 2. Newland to Avondale Shared Path, the replacement of the old Mangere Bridge, Tamaki Drive Cycleway, Medallion Link Drive Roading Project, and who can forget the City Rail Link, the Northern Busway Extension, the Northwest Bus Interim Improvements, Penlink, and Papakura to Pukekohe Rail Network Electrification. The good news is that these aren't just a series of random projects dreamed up by backroom engineers and planners. They're all part of a plan, the Regional Land Transport Plan. We'll now just show a quick video which was released at the time of consultation over the Regional Land Transport Plan.
Tamaki Makaurau is a popular place to live and it's growing fast. We're set to welcome another 260,000 people over the next decade, allowing over 2.3 million people to call Auckland home by 2050. Great cities start with great transport. Auckland has long been a car-focused city, and if we keep putting more cars on our roads every week, we could be at a complete standstill within a few years. So what are we doing to support Auckland's future transport needs? The Regional Land Transport Plan, or RLTP, is the 10-year plan for Auckland's transport network. The plan outlines the areas that Auckland Transport, Waka Kotahi and KiwiRail will focus on over the next 10 years to respond to our region's transport challenges. It is guided by several central and local government policies, strategies and decisions, and it can be influenced by your views as well. The projects in the RLTP will help us continue our efforts to protect the environment and address climate change issues. Public transport will be improved, with Aucklanders gaining new and more frequent rail services, as well as dedicated busways that run separately to traffic. The RLTP will deliver the City Rail Link, transporting more than 36,000 people every hour, giving customers more access to Auckland than ever before. It will provide better transport connections with new bus lanes, as well as plans for more than 200 kilometres of new and upgraded cycleways and shared paths. The RLTP is also set to provide transport infrastructure to accommodate new housing developments and a growing population. It will make our roads safer for everyone. Our Vision Zero strategy aim is to have zero deaths or serious injuries on our roads by 2050. Over the next 10 years, we will continue working hard to make Tamaki Makaurau better for everyone. He waka eke noa. We're all in this together.
So the Regional Land Transport Plan sets out the land transport objectives, policies and measures for the Auckland region over the next 10 years. It includes the land transport activities of Auckland Transport, Auckland Council, Waka Kotahi, KiwiRail, City Rail Link Limited and the Department of Conservation. Many more projects are in the pipeline, for instance 3 new rail stations in Drury and the Wiri to Key Park rail improvements. Looking further out is the implementation of the City Centre to Mangere Light Rail and the North West Rapid Transit project. The focus on sustainable transport mode also extends to cycling and walking, with 200 kilometres of new and upgraded cycleways and shared paths across our region. Several major state highway projects will also be completed in the next 3 years. Access and connectivity. The State Highway 1 Papakura to Drury South improvements will follow from the recently completed Southern Corridor improvements and will add capacity and improve journey time reliability for freight and those in light vehicles. The bottom line, over $37 billion is committed for critical projects and services over the next 10 years. And you wouldn't be surprised to hear me say just quietly that I expect that number to grow. But, and I say this with all due respect, it's going to take double or triple that number to deliver the transport system Aucklanders will be satisfied with. It's fairly clear that the same situation applies more broadly to many infrastructure classes across the motu. And even if all that funding was available right now or in the next 10 years, I think it's pretty unlikely, given the current context, that we as a country have the capacity to design, build and operate it. Realistically, we're going to be playing catch up with our transport infrastructure build for the next 20 to 30 years, perhaps longer. So it's becoming even more apparent that solely relying on building new infrastructure or retrofitting existing infrastructure alone is going to get us where we need to be by the time we need to be there. And yet I propose to you the way we've traditionally thought about these things is, particularly those of us who are clients, is that we've regularly reached for a new funding source and then sought to design and build something new. It's going to take something much more if we're going to address what our country needs. In Auckland's case, it's going to mean we have to use the $22 billion of transport assets that are just sitting on Auckland Transport's books. We're going to have to use them much, much smarter and sweat them much, much harder. And it's going to mean we have to take some bold steps in terms of changing people's behaviour. As I said, by doing what we've always done and by living and moving around our region the way we've always done, will mean not giving our region or our country what it needs. To illustrate, I'm going to use an example. Climate change has quite rightly been a major theme of this conference. In fact, in June 2019, Auckland Council declared a climate emergency. It followed this with Te Taruki Atawhiri, Auckland's climate plan, which identifies specific actions to achieve a 50% overall reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in Auckland by 2030. That's a hugely ambitious target, with transport being front and centre of that challenge, with around 40% of Auckland's carbon emissions coming from the transport system. With limited low-hanging fruit, and I use that term tongue-in-cheek, Auckland Council modelling shows that the transport system needs to contribute heavily to deliver a 64% reduction in emissions by 2030. As we all know, a plan is one thing. Actually executing with the available funding, supply chain constraints, and public support is quite another. The investment in public transport and other more sustainable modes of transport is one important strand in this comprehensive approach to addressing climate change. The RLTP will make significant progress towards reducing emissions from the public transport fleet through low emission buses, more electric trains on the rail network, and infrastructure to start the decarbonisation of the ferry fleet. Yet all this investment makes limited difference to Auckland's carbon emissions by 2030. In fact, we estimate it's somewhere between 1% and 5%. When we add in recently announced government initiatives such as the Clean Car Standards, the Clean Car Discount, and the biofuels mandate, we might see Auckland reach a 10 to 15% reduction in transport emissions by 2030. In short, there is still a yawning chasm between where we will land through investment alone and the targets. For the first time ever in New Zealand, our Auckland Regional Land Transport Plan proposes a number of policy responses to meet our strategic objectives, such as climate change. They include incentivising EV purchases and a change to current road pricing mechanisms, which both have the potential to have a material impact on emissions. It also proposes policies to accelerate mode shift, make the transport network safer, support growth and improve connectivity across the network. However, implementing these policy initiatives will require a sustained and coordinated push from all transport partners and, more importantly, our politicians. All of these initiatives are important, and I don't want to discourage you from taking personal action. In fact, far from it. But even if everyone on this session this morning was to run out and buy an EV tomorrow, it would make a very small difference. Indeed, there is a growing realisation that there is not enough supply of electric vehicles for New Zealand to rely on this alone. In fact, what we need to happen in cities like Christchurch, Wellington, Dunedin, Tauranga, Hamilton, and Tamaki Makaurau is for people to travel less in internal combustion light vehicles. To talk in plain language, that's our cars. It's likely to be around 40% less by 2030, and that's taking account of population growth. Around 5 to 6 times per year, we at Auckland Transport commission independent research into the views of Aucklanders. It's key to getting a real sense of the sentiment that the people of the region hold. In September this year, we commissioned research into Aucklanders' views on climate change. The sample of 507 was demographically representative of age, gender, and geography, and had a margin of error of plus or minus 4.4%. What we found was that 78% of Aucklanders, you could say the vast majority, but believe that we need to take action now in respect of climate change. That whakatauki that I recited at the start should be coming back to you. Yet, and these are the killer stats, only 46% of Aucklanders believe their day-to-day transport behaviour has an impact on the environment. Further, only 37% believe it's private vehicle users who collectively contribute most to road transport emissions, when in fact private vehicle users contribute circa 80% of all transport emissions. The research is not surprising. The global Ipsos survey completed in March this year found that people consistently overestimate the impact of small changes and underestimate the impact of bigger ones. Clearly, education is needed to tackle Aotearoa's climate challenge. In this context, it's becoming increasingly clear that a far greater discussion and dialogue is needed about how we optimise the use of our transport infrastructure and New Zealand's infrastructure more generally. In this vein, I'm particularly encouraged that Te Waihanga, New Zealand Infrastructure Commission's draft New Zealand Infrastructure Strategy, that's quite a mouthful, calls out the need for thinking about better using existing infrastructure, and particularly think about it in terms of design, educate, regulate, and price. We're also pleased to see the momentum building around changes to road pricing, particularly in Auckland, and the Community Connect scheme to offer discounted public transport to community services card holders. More nuanced pricing of infrastructure is a key lever that we need to get more serious about. It's clear to us that the changes we will need to see in the big cities and across our nation are going to rely on individual action or significant changes in behaviour from every New Zealander. In my mind, educate, regulate, price become powerful means to achieve the objectives we want for our nation. But coming back to that fork in the road, it's becoming crystal clear that we are now at crunch time. The needs of New Zealand in terms of new and renewed infrastructure are critical for our future. Incrementalism won't likely make the grade. We will need some significant reform. It also means we need to think about change and about courage. Institutional and societal change is never easy, but the gains are too great and the consequences too dire if we simply carry on doing what we've been doing for decades. Who here wants to live in the Los Angeles of the South Pacific or in a low-lying country in Southeast Asia under imminent threat of sea level rise? What is needed is swift recognition that action and change is needed now. And the political will bolstered by right-minded leaders from the business and other communities to make that call. From there, I say with a wry smile, the rest is easy. I want to now finish as I started with another whakatauki. Ko ngā pai tawhiti whaia kia tata. Ko ngā pai tata whakamaua kia tina. The potential for tomorrow is determined by what we do today. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Well, kia ora, Shane, and thank you for that very insightful presentation and reflections. And I think you've certainly given us a bit of a call to action for everyone, particularly with such beautiful and powerful whakataukis that you've used, and maybe just touching on that first one, which is really around intergenerational, for us and our children after us, and creating those intergenerational things. And I think what we've certainly heard of a theme over the last 4 days is that it demands something very different. We can't continue the status quo, and we're going to have to do things at that sort of pace. And there's a question here that really touches on that a little bit, which was probably talking about, sorry, I'm just scrolling down to see it, but it just kind of reflected on some of the projects that you had showed up. But I think they're probably saying, the question was, are we adapting quickly enough? What more do we need to do?
Look, Tracy, it's a really, really good question. And I think the evidence is pretty clear. No, we're not. We've got to call it out. No, we're not adapting quickly enough. And it's quite amazing with ATAP and the investment that's proposed in there. The majority of that investment is loaded towards public transport investment and sustainable modes. And yet it's not going to deliver us the kind of changes we need at the pace we need. And I guess that's the big call out. We really need to, the country can't afford to just rely on that alone. We need to make some big shifts.
Brilliant. Not surprisingly, there's lots of questions here, and I'm conscious about time, so I'll go with the most popular ticks. You mentioned that you need to use the $22 billion of transport assets we already have, and you talked about using them smarter and sweating them harder. Can you just explain your thoughts around this? How would we do it?
Yeah, look, Tracy, that's it's a tough conversation we're going to have with our community because, and when I talk about 22 billion, that's just the assets that we steward at Auckland Transport. When you throw in the Waka Kotahi State Highways, the Kiwi Rail network, the buses that are owned by our bus operators and so forth, I'm sure the number's well north of 30 billion. But if you think about that in terms of what the proportion of those assets are made up of, it's well north of 80% is around our roads. There must be close to 8,000 kilometres of roads across the Auckland region alone, let alone the rest of the country. How do we use those roads better to achieve the outcomes we need in terms of productivity, in terms of climate change? And so, we've been pretty reluctant generally to sweat those assets. Time of day use for those moving, for freight, higher occupancy, prioritisation, all those sorts of things. I think we really need to get serious about that over the next 3 or 4 years.
Brilliant. Here's another question, probably touching a little bit more on those behaviour sort of changes. So it says New Zealand, like a lot of other countries, want the change collectively, but are not prepared to change their behaviour. They will not voluntarily move away from the convenient modes of transport, cars. And I suppose we've seen that really impacted over the last 2 years with COVID, right? And the impact on public transport and everything. So are we thinking congestion charges, which have successfully reduced trips in large cities in Europe? So you did touch around EVs and but what that plays, but also around pricing mechanisms. So I don't know, Shane, if you want to comment on that.
Yeah, look, this is I guess that's why the draft infrastructure strategy and the educate, regulate, price type pillar that's in there, I think it's a pillar that it's called, really resonates with me because many people, the research is telling us, as many people feel the need to make the change, they actually just don't know what it is. So there's an education piece clearly, but I think we've got to, the reality is it's going to take more than educate. I mean, and that's what the question is really referring to. We're going to need regulation and some of the steps that we've seen in the last 12 to 18 months around incentivising EVs, obviously, but also pricing of road use and discounting of PT use. We're starting to make baby steps, but I think we're not going to have a whole lot of time to keep making baby steps. At some point, we're going to have to pick up the pace.
Great. We have about 90 seconds left. So this is very popular. Does Auckland Transport think in transport-oriented development format, so we don't need lots of transport investment in the future?
Look, it's the dialogue and the dialogue that we are having and the relationships that are being built between transport agencies and the likes of Kāinga Ora, Panuku, Eke Panuku. There's a really strong kind of collaboration starting to happen. It's been a bit slow to start, but the momentum is picking up really quickly. I'm really proud of the work we're doing with Eke Panuku on the Eastern Busway, where we're really looking at opportunities to do TODs.
Fantastic. And conscious again, clock's time down. Just quickly, you said you didn't speak to us for since 2018, and we're delighted to have Auckland Transport and yourself here today sponsoring this session. But if you had a magic wand and the one thing, and coming back next year, what would you be proud? What would be the courageous thing to do?
Oh, look, we're really looking forward to having engagement and dialogue with Aucklanders in the next 12 months on things like the parking strategy. It's kind of been a little bit of noise in the last few weeks about it, but it's a conversation we must have, with no parking minimums required now around properties. It's going to put a real squeeze on road spaces, cars, people, competing uses for our roads is going to become quite difficult. So really looking forward to the engagement we're going to have in Auckland with Aucklanders over the next 12 months on that.
Fantastic. Kia ora, Shane. Thank you, Auckland Transport. And now for everyone else, we have a next session starting, building from broader outcomes. So if we come out of this and join in the next one. Thank you, Shane, again.
Thanks, Tracy.